Sarah had always believed that life settled into its own rhythm after a certain age. For years, she and her husband Mark had built a quiet existence together in the peaceful neighborhood of Oakwood Creek. Their children were grown and living their own lives. The house was no longer filled with the noise of busy mornings and late-night homework sessions, and most days followed a comfortable routine that rarely changed. She worked part-time at a local library, spent her afternoons tending to her garden, and enjoyed evenings with Mark, who was as energetic and optimistic as ever. Their marriage was stable, dependable, and built on decades of shared memories. Sarah considered herself fortunate, even if there were moments when she found herself staring out the kitchen window wondering how quickly the years had passed. One afternoon, Mark called on his drive home from work. His voice carried its usual mixture of enthusiasm and distraction as he navigated traffic while discussing 3 different thoughts at once. During the conversation, he casually mentioned that his younger brother David would be staying with them for several days. David was passing through town to handle some business matters and needed a place to stay. Sarah agreed immediately, though privately she felt uncertain. She had never disliked David, but she had never truly known him either. He was one of those people who seemed impossible to define. While Mark had built a stable career and family life, David had spent years moving from city to city, chasing opportunities, starting projects, and exploring places Sarah had only seen in photographs. Family gatherings rarely lasted long enough for meaningful conversations, and David always seemed to remain slightly distant, as though part of him was somewhere else entirely. When David arrived a few days later, he looked much as she remembered. He carried a worn suitcase that reflected years of travel and possessed the same thoughtful expression that had always made him difficult to read. His greeting was polite and warm enough, and before long he and Mark were laughing about childhood memories that Sarah had heard countless times before. She listened from the kitchen as she prepared dinner, feeling like an observer watching 2 brothers reconnect. Throughout the evening, David spoke less than Mark, offering occasional comments while spending long stretches simply listening. More than once, Sarah noticed him gazing out the window toward the backyard, as if lost in thought. Later that night, Mark disappeared into his home office to prepare for an early meeting. Sarah found herself alone in the kitchen with David as she cleaned up after dinner. The silence between them felt awkward at first, and she searched for something to say. She asked about his recent travels, expecting brief answers. Instead, after a moment of hesitation, he began describing some of the places he had lived over the years. His stories were not dramatic adventures, but quiet observations about people he had met, cities he had grown attached to, and moments that had stayed with him long after he left. For the first time, Sarah sensed something beneath his reserved nature. There was intelligence there, certainly, but also a kind of loneliness she had never noticed before. The following morning, Mark left for work before sunrise. Sarah expected David to spend the day handling his business, but when she entered the kitchen, she found him already awake, drinking coffee and watching birds gather near the feeder outside. He had made a fresh pot for both of them. It was a small gesture, yet it immediately made the morning feel more comfortable. They shared coffee while sunlight spilled across the kitchen floor, and for the first time conversation flowed naturally. David asked about her life, not in the polite way people often did, but with genuine curiosity. He wanted to know what filled her days, what she enjoyed, what mattered to her. When Sarah mentioned her garden, his interest surprised her. He asked questions about the flowers she grew and eventually requested a tour of the backyard. Together they wandered through the garden while she pointed out different plants and explained which ones were thriving and which ones constantly tested her patience. David listened attentively, noticing details most visitors overlooked. He admired the small decorative pieces tucked among the flower beds and commented on the effort required to maintain such a peaceful space. His observations made Sarah feel strangely appreciated. It wasn't simply that he admired the garden. It felt as though he recognized the care and thought she had invested in creating it. Their conversation stretched throughout the morning. They discussed books, travel, changing seasons, and the subtle ways people evolve over time. David shared stories about rooftop gardens he had encountered in large cities and community projects that brought strangers together. Sarah discovered that beneath his quiet exterior was someone deeply observant and reflective. He wasn't merely a traveler collecting experiences. He was someone constantly searching for meaning within them. As the days passed, a comfortable friendship developed between them. There was nothing inappropriate about it. The connection grew from conversation rather than attraction. Sarah found herself looking forward to their discussions because they touched subjects she rarely explored with anyone else. Mark was a wonderful husband, but he approached life differently. He focused on goals, plans, and practical solutions. David seemed more interested in questions and answers. He noticed emotional undercurrents and often spoke about ideas that lingered long after conversations ended. One evening after dinner, Mark became occupied with work calls, leaving Sarah and David sitting in the living room near the fireplace. Rain tapped softly against the windows, creating a peaceful atmosphere. David picked up a novel from a stack of books beside Sarah's chair and flipped through a few pages before setting it down again. After several quiet minutes, he asked a question that caught her completely off guard. "Are you happy?" The question wasn't asked dramatically or with any hidden agenda. It was simple, sincere, and impossible to answer casually. Sarah thought for a moment before responding. She explained that she loved her life, loved her husband, and appreciated everything they had built together. Yet she admitted there were times when she wondered about different possibilities. Not because she regretted her choices, but because every life inevitably leaves certain paths unexplored. There were dreams she had once considered, places she might have lived, versions of herself she never became. David listened carefully. When she finished speaking, he nodded as though he understood exactly what she meant. He confessed that despite all his travels and constant movement, he often wondered about the opposite path. While Sarah occasionally questioned the adventures she had not taken, he sometimes questioned the stability he had never chosen. He had spent years chasing opportunities only to discover that certainty and belonging could be just as valuable as freedom. The conversation that followed felt unlike anything Sarah had experienced in years. They spoke honestly about aging, identity, ambition, and the strange realization that no matter which choices people make, they inevitably imagine the alternatives. There was no judgment in their exchange. Instead, there was recognition. For the first time in a very long while, Sarah felt completely understood. What affected her most was not anything David said directly. It was a feeling of being seen. He seemed to recognize parts of her personality that often remained hidden beneath daily routines. He noticed her thoughtfulness, her curiosity, and the quiet questions she carried but rarely voiced. The experience was unexpectedly emotional. Sarah realized how much of her inner world she kept private, even from people she loved. When Mark eventually returned to the room, cheerful and unaware of the depth of the conversation that had taken place, everything appeared perfectly normal. Yet Sarah sensed that something important had shifted within her, not in her marriage, and not in her feelings toward David, but within herself. A few days later, David's visit came to an end. The departure itself was uneventful. Mark hugged his brother and insisted he visit more often. David thanked them both for their hospitality and promised to stay in touch. As he loaded his suitcase into the rental car, he exchanged a brief glance with Sarah. No words were necessary. Both understood that their conversations had meant something meaningful. After he left, life gradually returned to normal. Mark resumed his familiar routines. Work remained busy, and the house settled back into its usual quiet rhythm. Yet Sarah found herself reflecting on David's visit more often than she expected. His questions had encouraged her to examine parts of herself she had neglected for years. She spent more time writing in a journal, recording thoughts she might previously have ignored. She became more engaged during discussions at her book club, and found herself speaking with greater confidence about her opinions. Her garden became more than a hobby. It became a place where she could think, reflect, and reconnect with herself. One evening, Mark commented that she seemed different somehow, more thoughtful, perhaps. Sarah smiled and told him she had simply been doing a lot of thinking lately. He accepted the answer without pressing further, and returned to reading emails on his laptop. The truth was difficult to explain. David's visit had not introduced chaos into her life. It had not threatened her marriage or inspired dramatic change. Instead, it had given her something far more subtle. It reminded her that growth does not always arrive through major events. Sometimes it emerges through a conversation, a question, or an unexpected connection with someone who views the world differently. Sarah still loved the life she had built. She still loved Mark. The foundation of her world remained unchanged, yet she now carried a deeper awareness of herself. She understood that contentment and curiosity could exist side by side. A person could appreciate their choices while still wondering about roads not taken. Those questions did not diminish happiness. They enriched it. Months later, whenever she stood among her roses in the quiet afternoon sunlight, she occasionally remembered the conversation she had shared with David. Not because she wished for a different life, but because those conversations had helped her better understand the one she already had. Sometimes the most meaningful encounters are not the ones that transform our circumstances. They are the ones that reveal something hidden within us and allow us to see ourselves more clearly than before. And in the end, that unexpected clarity became the true gift of David's visit.